Chapter 1. The Breath of the Promise. The desert lay spread out like a furnace-hot sea, covered by endless waves of sand that stretched to the horizon, where the sky and earth merged into a haze of copper. The air was thick and heavy, imbued with the scent of dry wormwood and the searing sun. Every breath was a trial, every step a struggle. The sun hung suspended above the skyline, like a burning sigil of ultimate test, casting long, trembling shadows that carried the promise of swift, yet always deceptive, evening rest. 40 years of exhausting pilgrimage had transformed the people of Israel into a weary, grayish river that nonetheless flowed forward with its last drop of will, because in its channel still glowed an unquenchable spark. Ahead lay Canaan, the land that Elohim himself, the Almighty Lord, had promised to their ancestors. This was not merely territory, it was the physical embodiment of hope, a metaphysical point where their entire destiny was to be fulfilled. Moses, the 80-year-old leader who carried upon his shoulders the burden of millions of lives and the even greater burden of the divine word, stood on a high point, peering into the endless, scorched horizon. His eyes, which had witnessed the flame of the burning bush, the terrifying majesty of Sinai, and the cloven waters of the Red Sea, now sought but one thing: greenery. The sandy wind swept up from beneath his feet, like the whisper of ancient voices, reminding him of covenants and transgressions, of faith and doubts that had slept in the sands for centuries. A little further, he whispered, and this voice, which had once halted Pharaoh's chariots, was now just a weary rustle, intended only for his own heart. And we will see the land of milk and honey, the real land, not a mirage. Yet, despite his fatigue, his faith was solid, like the granite of Sinai. He knew that leading the people out of Egypt was only half the task. The real test began now. Was a people born in slavery worthy to enter into a possession gained solely by God's grace? It was at this moment of highest tension and uncertainty that the command rang out, a step that led to the greatest tragedy of their journey. Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. Moses, according to the divine ordinance, chose 12 men, one, the most esteemed and trusted, from each tribe. This was the epitome of trust. Upon these men, upon their spiritual strength and purity of vision, rested the responsibility for the destiny of the entire nation. Among them, 2 stood out: Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, whose soul was like copper, strong and unyielding before fear, and Joshua, the son of Nun, who stood closest to Moses, a young man whose eyes blazed with such unwavering faith that it seemed he already saw the coming dawn over the mountains of Canaan. Before their departure, the camp fell silent. Approximately 1 million people gathered in a quiet, strained expectation, resembling the stillness before an earthquake. No one spoke. Even the children instinctively sensed the monumentality of the moment and did not cry. All watched as the shadows of the 12 men faded into the fiery desert haze, heading towards the unknown land. They carried not only their own provisions, but also the invisible, heavy load of all the hopes and all the fears of Israel. Moses blessed them with a voice that had regained its majesty. His words were the final charge, the last chance to anchor the truth in their hearts. Do not be afraid, sons of Israel. Go and observe this land. Are the people who live there strong or weak? Are they few or many? Are their cities merely camps or fortified strongholds? Is their land good or bad? And most importantly, bring back not just the fruits, but also faith. The Lord goes before you. You will see that the land is good, for God Himself has prepared it for us, and He prepares nothing but perfection for His people. Do not fear their strength, for our strength is not in muscles, but in His covenant. And the messengers left. They crossed the last boundary, separating the wilderness from the promise, entering a land where clouds touched the mountaintops, and the wind smelled of rivers, moss, and ripening fruit. But would they be able to return with the same purity of heart with which they set out? This question, like an unspoken prayer, hung over the emptied camp, awaiting an answer that would determine the fate of a generation. They went not just to scout the land, they went to scout their own souls, and the land of Canaan was to be the mirror of their faith. Chapter 2. The Shadows of Canaan. The transition was like plunging from a gray, scorched world into a forgotten paradise. As soon as their feet touched the ground, separating the desert sands from the Canaanite foothills, they were enveloped by a feeling of incredible, almost divine generosity. Before them unfolded a lush valley, illuminated by a soft, filtered light. The relentless copper disk of the desert sun did not beat down here. Instead, a gentle, golden light shone, and even the air was sweet, thick with the aromas of ripe fruit and the diversity of flowers unknown to the wilderness. Waters flowed, tinkling like pure silver, and grapevines, like green waves, covered the hills that rose toward the sky. It was a world that existed outside the experience of slaves and travelers, a world where nature seemed not to demand sacrifices, but only to offer a gift. Caleb and Joshua stood in silence, dazzled, their hearts overflowing with solemn joy. "This is it," Caleb whispered, and in his voice sounded only the unwavering faith that had found its material confirmation. The promised land. God did not deceive us in a single word, in a single detail. It is waiting. But the other 10 messengers looked on with dread, and that dread grew exponentially, obscuring the joy of discovery. Their slave consciousness, accustomed to seeing abundance only as a temporary trap or the cruelty of a master, could not accept this sudden grace. They began to look for treachery, and treachery they found. The cities, fortified with walls, rose on the hills like massive, insurmountable stone giants. The walls were so enormous that they seemed to have grown out of the earth itself, rather than built by human hands. They were covered with the moss of centuries and seemed to mock the primitive tents of the Israelite camp. But the greatest terror was brought by the inhabitants themselves. The people there were strong, tall, incomparably mightier than the Israelites, who were weakened by desert life and the heritage of slavery. They walked the streets with proud nonchalance, armed to the teeth, and their faces radiated an ancient, unbroken power. One of the 10, named Shemua, whose heart had already darkened with treacherous fear, was the first to voice what gnawed at every one of his companions. "This is the land of giants. This is the region where the sons of Anak live. Their shoulders are wider than our gates. We are merely grasshoppers in their eyes." Grasshoppers. What are our muscles? What is our staff against their bronze swords and these walls that seem to reach the clouds? The 10 hearts began to darken like a sunset before an inevitable storm. They saw not a blessing, but a trap. They saw not a promise, but a sentence. The miracle of the land became for them only a backdrop that magnified their own insignificance and weakness. They forgot how Moses had parted the sea and remembered only how small and pitiful their fathers had been in the presence of Egyptian guards. Only two, Caleb and Joshua, retained the light of faith. They saw the same giants, but their eyes saw something else, the majesty of the one who stood behind them. If God had promised this land, he had already accounted for both the giants and the walls. To bring proof of what they had seen, they cut down a cluster of grapes from the valley of Eshcol, so incredibly large and heavy that two men had to carry it on a pole between them. It was not just fruit, it was living, juicy evidence of Canaan's generosity, bursting with crimson and golden hues. They also gathered pomegranates, whose skin was topped with juice, and figs, sweet and sticky, to show the people how generous and rich the land was. However, as they returned, the look in the eyes of the 10 already held the shadow of doubt, which grew and gained strength, sucking the light from their eyes like a vampire. This was not merely fear. It was an act of renunciation of trust, a betrayal born not in action, but in the moment their gaze was fixed on the giant, not on God. They left Canaan carrying the fruits of hope, but in their hearts they carried the seeds of panic, ready to sprout in the darkness of the camp. Chapter 3. They returned. 40 days passed, and the silence in the camp of Kadesh became unbearable. This silence was filled with such tension that the air seemed about to burst, like an overstretched string. Each day was like a heavy pendulum swing, ticking away the minutes until the decisive moment. And when finally, figures appeared from behind the sandy dune, heading toward the camp, the people gathered around them like a sea sensing a storm and rushing to the shore. A million eyes, thirsty and exhausted, were fixed on the 12 messengers. Moses stood in front, staff in hand, his face calm like an autumn lake, but his eyes, capable of seeing the future, were filled with unspoken, cold anxiety. He saw not only the tired faces of the men, but also something dark clinging to them, like desert dust, a shadow that came with them from Canaan. "Tell us what you saw," Moses said, and his voice, despite the fatigue, rang out like a bell in the strange silence. Shemua, one of the elders, spoke first. He began with the obvious, with the truth that was meant to reassure. The land truly flows with milk and honey. We brought its fruits as proof. Look at this cluster of grapes. It weighs as much as a child. It is the richest region we have ever seen. A true blessing from God. The fire of hope flared up in the people's eyes. They gazed eagerly at the cluster, which two men could barely carry on a pole, at the pomegranates that resembled clots of blood, and the figs that smelled of fresh honey. But in the next moment, Shemua's face contorted, and he released the first dose of poison into the crowd, like a snake hiding in the grass. But the people who live there are strong. Their strength is inhuman. The cities are large and fortified, with walls that reach the sky. They live in the rocks, like predatory eagles. And the most terrifying thing is that we saw the sons of Anak, true giants. They are so tall that our spears will not reach their heads. The crowd buzzed, and this hum was more terrifying than any scream. Fear, like a cold, sticky wind, swept through the ranks, tearing every crumb of faith from their hearts. People clasped their heads, some fell to their knees, and the camp turned into an arena of collective madness. They did not see the majesty of God. but they felt the weight of a gigantic heel, ready to crush them. The words of the 10 messengers poured down like a hail of stones, turning fact into panic, and the promise into a curse. We cannot go against them. We will be like grasshoppers to them, like despicable insects. They will crush us like dust. They are stronger than the Egyptians, for here there is no sea to part us, and no cloud to shield us. Why did we leave Egypt? They cried out. It would have been better to die there, under the whip, but with fullness. It would have been better to die here, in this wilderness, than to be humiliated and killed by giants. But amidst this clamor, amidst this chaos of despair, the voice of Caleb, whose spirit was undefiled, arose. We can and we shall enter this land. Why have you so quickly forgotten God? Is he not the one who tears down walls and tramples enemies? The Lord is with us. Do not fear them. They are our bread. Their defense has departed from them, for they do not know our God. Joshua joined him. They tore their clothes as a sign of deep, burning sorrow and protest against this unbelief that was tearing the people apart. Their words were aflame, but the shouts of the 10 were like a torrent of mud extinguishing that flame. The 10 messengers spoke louder, their words spreading like poison among the people, reflecting their own internal fear, which they now presented as objective truth. They convinced the crowd that God, it turned out, was not mighty enough to stand against high walls. And that night, the people wept. These were not tears of repentance, but tears of unbelief, bitter and futile, flowing not from a broken heart, but from a cowardly soul. They mourned not their sinfulness, but the loss of the meat and onions they had exchanged for a phantom freedom. It was a rebellion of tears, which, nonetheless, were heavier than stones. Chapter 4. The night of rebellion. The darkness that descended upon the camp was not merely the absence of light. It was a thick, physical darkness that enveloped the soul, turning it into a field for cultivating the worst fears. From every tent, from every corner of the vast camp, a whisper arose. It was low, vibrational, like the sound of a swarm of poisonous bees. It was the whisper of unbelief, disillusionment, and, most importantly, anger. First, the people wept, but the tears quickly dried, leaving only a salty crust of malice on their faces. Let us choose another leader, voices rang out, no longer concealing their intent. Moses led us here to kill us. He and his brother Aaron have too much power. Let us find someone to lead us back to Egypt, where there is at least life, even in bondage. The plan of betrayal quickly took shape, a practical, sinister logic born of panic. They began to discuss whom to elect instead of Moses, how to gather provisions for the journey back through the wilderness, and how to convince Egypt to take them back, acknowledging their defeat. Every tent turned into a small cell of rebellion, where fear, multiplied by pride, passed a death sentence on the prophet and his mission. Meanwhile, Moses knelt before the tabernacle, the place of God's presence. The fire in the lamp flickered with his heavy, interrupted breathing, casting shadows on the tent walls like wings. He was the epitome of loneliness. He was pained not because he was betrayed, but because the people for whom he had left the luxury of Pharaoh's court had turned not from him, but from the one who sent him. It was a betrayal not of a leader, but of truth itself. Lord, he whispered, and his voice was but a shadow of a voice. This people is like a child that has not learned to walk. that rejects the outstretched hand. They have seen your wonders, and yet they do not believe. How much longer, Almighty, will you endure? Their heart, their stubbornness, their memory that retains only evil? He was not answered by silence, but suddenly the sky above the tabernacle flashed with thunder that rolled from mountain to mountain. The air thickened like molten lead. The voice of God boomed forth like a storm emerging from silence, but its power was such that Moses fell upon his face. How long will this people despise me? How long will they refuse to believe me, despite all the signs I have performed among them? I could destroy them with a single breath, erase their rebellion, and create from you, Moses, a nation greater and mightier. Moses, feeling his body tremble on the cold sand, began his hardest prayer, a prayer of intercession, a prayer of despair. He pleaded not for forgiveness for them, but for the preservation of the honor of God's name before the nations who had seen the wonders of Egypt. And then the verdict rang out, immovable and final, shattering the night. Because of their unbelief, they shall not enter the promised land. They shall not see the land they spoke of contemptuously. Their bodies, the bodies of all 20 years old and upward who grumbled, shall fall in the wilderness. They shall wander in this sand until the last of those who scorned my word perishes. But their children, those for whom they worried and said would become prey, shall enter there. Their life in the wilderness shall last 40 years, a year for each day your spies spent in Canaan. This shall be the atonement for their sin of unbelief. 40 years of wandering and penance, stretched into an endless cycle. This verdict was not merely punishment, but also an act of mercy, allowing the old generation to complete its journey without annihilation, and the new one to be born and grow up in freedom before receiving the greatest gift. Moses heard this and understood. He had led slaves out of Egypt, but only the wilderness could bury their fear and raise free people. Chapter 5. Wrath and Mercy. When Moses came out to the people the next morning, his face was stern, like a rock standing against a hurricane. There was no anger in his eyes, but a searing sorrow that was heavier than any accusation. The glory of the Lord had not entirely vanished above the tabernacle, and the people, whose eyes were red from the night's tears and malice, sensed that their fate had already been decided. "You did not believe the Lord," he said, and his voice rang out like molten lead, pouring truth into their ears. "Your words were spoken in the Lord's presence, and he heard them. Because of your wicked grumbling, this generation will not see the promised land. You scorned the gift, and therefore you will not receive it. Your sons will bear your burden for 40 years, wandering in the wilderness, until the last of those who grumbled and refused to believe perishes." The silence that fell upon the camp was heavy, like lead just poured from a crucible. This silence was filled with the terror of realization. They stood, heads bowed, understanding that their rebellion, their nocturnal plan of return, had turned into the most terrible thing, a curse placed upon their own lives. It was not war that destroyed them, but their own fear. And suddenly, as they realized they were too late for the blessing, a strange, warped form of repentance manifested. It was not regret for the sin, but regret for the lost opportunity, born of shame and despair. "We have sinned!" Some cried out, their voices hysterical and strained. "We will go! We will go where the Lord commanded. We will redeem our guilt with blood. They decided they could cheat fate, that they could earn what was lost through lack of faith. This was a rebellion against the verdict, a desire to prove to God that they could be strong enough. But their haste was false. It was an act of self-assertion, not obedience. Moses, seeing this flash of futile energy, tried to stop them. His voice was both a plea and a warning. Do not go. Do not do this. Your heart is too late for obedience. The Lord is no longer with you in this endeavor, for you have rejected his covenant. If you go, you will meet only death. Nevertheless, some, blinded by shame, disgrace, and a desire to prove their courage, did not listen. It was a disorganized group of people, driven by despair. They gathered their spears and swords, climbed the mountain peaks, separating them from the land of the Amorites, and moved into battle without God's blessing, without hope of victory. It was an act of suicide, disguised as heroism. History quickly wrote its bloody page. The Amorites and the Canaanites, enraged by their unexpected invasion, routed them. A cry arose over the wilderness, but it was no longer the cry of grumbling, but the cry of agony. Instead of a triumphant return, only wounded fugitives came back to the camp, bringing news of complete defeat, of a shame that was worse than Egyptian slavery. Their blood was spilled in vain, only confirming the immutability of God's word. Moses stood and watched this chaos, and his heart tore with pain. His people paid a double price, for unbelief, and then for unauthorized, hasty action that was only a distorted reflection of faith. All that remained was silence, the long, eternal silence of 40 years of penance. Chapter 6. 40 years of solitude. The wilderness became not just a place of wandering, but a gigantic, living prison, whose walls consisted of a constantly receding horizon. Days passed like grains of sand slipping through a clenched fist. Years dissolved in the hot winds, turning into an endless, monotonous cycle. This was not annihilation, but the slow decomposition of hope. The punishment was not swift death, but a barren, meaningless, cyclical movement that brought them back every morning to the place from which they had departed. Those who wept that night, who grumbled, who remembered the taste of Egyptian onions and feared the giants, departed one by one into the sand. Their names were carved on temporary stone markers that were quickly destroyed by wind and time, becoming part of the sand in which they refused to believe. This was the tragedy of the lost generation. They died not from the sword or disease, but from their own doubt. They were the eternal prisoners of the wilderness they themselves had chosen. But as the old generation declined, their children grew up. This was a generation born in freedom, whose lungs had never inhaled the foul air of slave barracks, whose eyes had never seen Pharaoh's whips. They did not know Egypt, but they knew the wilderness. They knew the tabernacle and the daily, unchanging miracle of the manna. They carried the burden of stories about a land they had not seen, but in which they believed, for that faith was the only inheritance left by their parents. The wilderness was for them a school of endurance and unconditional dependence on God. They saw the manna fall every morning, but for them, it was no longer just bread, but proof of the Creator's daily, unwavering faithfulness. Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun, traveled with this new, hardened generation. They were living monuments who had survived the sands. Time had covered their faces with a patina, and their hair had turned white, but their eyes retained the same fiery gaze, that had seen the majesty of Canaan 40 years ago. They had not forgotten that cluster of grapes. They had not forgotten the light on the mountaintops, which now became their only horizon. They were witnesses, not only of God's wrath, but also of his patience. They silently taught the new generation that time is God's instrument by which he purifies the heart. And when 40 years had elapsed, and the last of the grumbling generation found his rest in the sands, the Lord spoke again to Moses and to the new generation, with a voice now filled with warmth and fulfillment. Now you shall go, for your hearts have been cleansed in the sands, and your eyes have learned to look not with fear, but with faith. You are a new army. I know your faces. I know your hunger. I have not forgotten the promise. Go forward. The people, born and raised in the wilderness, were finally ready. They redeemed the sin of their fathers, not with blood, but with time and faith. Chapter 7. New Dawn. The dawn was unlike any they had seen in 40 years. It was a dawn filled with final, unyielding determination. The camp moved out, not with a hum and a grumble, but in complete, solemn silence. They stood on the banks of the Jordan, a river that symbolized the boundary between penance and possession. The sun was rising over the wilderness, pouring gold across the dunes, but its rays, for the first time, carried the warmth of hope, not of trial. The young warriors, hardened in skirmishes and born in discipline, held their spears with firm resolve. Women carried children, holding them close to their chests, but there was no fear in their eyes, for they knew they were led by a guidance that would not fail. And the elders, those who had survived 40 years and seen the death of their fathers, walked silently, their eyes filled with deep, hard-won gratitude. Caleb, now an old man of 85 years, looked at the horizon. There, in the distance, lay the promised land, not a phantom, not a mirage, but a living, green reality lying beyond the wall of water. He remembered that day, 40 years ago, when his voice was drowned out by the crowd, and the pain he felt seeing the rejection. Finally, he said, and the words were like the crown of 40 years of service. We have arrived. We have come not by the strength of our arms, for we were weak. We have come by the strength of faith, which was forged in patience. Our God keeps his word. Joshua, his companion, who had now become the new leader, stood beside him, preparing for the last, decisive step. Upon him lay the unbearable burden of Moses, who was no longer among them. Moses had died on Mount Nebo, having looked at the land, but not entered it. This was the last, most magnificent, and most dramatic sacrifice, forever emphasizing that no one, not even the greatest righteous man, can enter the promise through their own perfection, but only through grace. The Lord is not one who forgets, Joshua said. He is only one who purifies. We must only remember his path. The fathers paid for doubt. We receive the gift for trust. Our first task is not to take, but to believe. The sky brightened, and the wind rang out again over the wilderness. It was the same wind that once carried words of fear, and now carried the song of hope. Ahead lay the Jordan, which was to part, and the fortress walls of Jericho, which were to fall. But the heart of the people was ready. Epilogue. The generation of unbelief fell into the sand, but from its dust, from its mistakes and its tears, a generation of hope arose. The wilderness, that cruel mother, became the sternest school, teaching one eternal truth. God gave man not only the land, but also time. Time for the heart to learn to trust. And after 40 years, Israel understood the greatest battle is not the battle against giants, whose walls reach the heavens, but the battle against one's own doubt, which is the only real wall separating man from his destiny. Doubt destroys covenants. Faith builds kingdoms in their place. And so, through curse and redemption, through death and resurrection, the people of the promise finally set foot on the land that had awaited them for 40 years.